I'm a Brazilian. I'm also a malware analyst. Thus, I learned malware analysis in Brazil with Brazilian malware samples. What's interesting about that is that the outcomes I got used to have from my analysis were often very different than what's reported in the global literature, and I always wondered why. Was I doing anything wrong? But the reason is that attacks are very tied to the country and culture of the attacked population, and we often do not realize that, and thus we miss great defensive opportunities. I'll show you why. We got used to news like this that generalize everything as a global trend. Thus, companies will invest billions to protect their customers against these reported trends and threats. But in the other side of the world, distinct trends might be taking place. If we had paid attention to that, we might have predicted some of the attackers' movement migrating from one place to another. So, have you ever considered that the emergence of a new malware attack might be related to the country and culture of the attacked population? Do you know what happened outside in the world in countries that are not covered in the homogeneous threat reports? If you answered no, come with me in a journey through the Brazilian banking system. The Brazilian banking system has undergone through many modifications and evolutions over time that covers from the early computerization to the adoption of mobile devices. And thus, I will consider this as a temporal guide from our journey. The first attempt to computerize the Brazilian banking system dates back to the 80s. By that time, the Brazilian banking ecosystem was already as computerized as the US one. The reason for that is that the Brazilians suffered from a period of very high inflation, so people could not keep up with the daily price changes. So they decided to mitigate this problem by computerizing everything. So they would migrate the banks from the physical to the digital world. They deployed applications to be installed in the user's desktop machine so they could interact with the bank via internet. What's the problem with that? The problem is that attackers migrated from the physical to the digital world as well. As you can see here, they deployed fake banking applications trying to impersonate the legitimate banking ones so as to deceive users into providing their credentials for the attackers. Notice, I'm here talking about applications, not pages. This was way before the adoption of web banking. And here is the first example of a cultural related attack, because this attack only succeeded because the Brazilian banks indeed have a legitimate banking application that resembles this fake one. This kind of attack would not make sense elsewhere at that time. And in fact, the antivirus of that time, the global security solutions, were not very good at detecting this kind of threat because these samples did not mixed and affected a lot the system in the sense of exploiting any vulnerability, escalating privilege, or dropping some other payload. The only action they were doing, that system, was deceiving users into provide their credential. So what's being exploited here in the last instance is not a technological issue, or not only a technological issue, but the human inability to distinguish between a legitimate and a fake application. And why does it matter? Because decades later, after the emergence of this kind of threat in Brazil, we are still falling to the same attacks. But now just in a new technological fashion. Now we have kind of SMS like this that presents you a link that redirects you to a fake page or a fake applications. So although it emerged the first time in Brazil many years ago, or at least become widespread first in Brazil many years ago, we are still falling to the same kind of attack because in the instance, again, is not only a technological issue that's being exploited, but this human inability to distinguish between a legitimate and a fake application or page or whatever. And well, people might say, okay, but this happens everywhere in the world, so let's be a bit more specific about Brazil. So this is a boleto. This is a Brazilian payment method. As far as I know, it only exists in Brazil. And here's another example of a threat and derived threats that could originate in Brazil and then spread all around the world. But why do a boleto even exist? And the reason is that although the banks were computerized by that time, the population was not. So they have to create a way to intermediate transactions between the online people, that includes the bank and some customer, and the offline population, that were the people that do not have access to the internet or to a computer. So they created this kind of intermediate transaction method. So anyone with access to a computerized system could print a boleto and provide to an offline people. And offline people could, in the last instance, make it back to the digital world by scanning the barcode. So in this scenario, you may say, okay, so offline people are safe. They are free from malware, they are free from being affected by electronic threats, right? And of course not, because what happened in the end is that attackers created the boletos malware, a kind of malware that infects a system and then hook into the printing subsystem to print a fake boleto, a fake barcode. So the infected people would be printing a boleto, believing that it is a real boleto, that it's displaying the correct payment method, the correct agency and account number, and so on. But in fact, it's printing a distinct code that points to an attacker banking account, and then it will be delivered to the offline people that will then pay this boleto to the attacker instead of the legitimate owner of the boleto. So here I ask, does your threat model include offline people? Probably not. But okay, some might say I'm talking about old stuff. So let's talk about what happened when banks moved to the web, when banks adopted web pages and internet banking, as you probably know. Due to a partnership with some banks' computer security incident response teams, I have been for the last 80 years working on a data set of more than 4,000 unique malware samples collected by the banks in their customers' machines. They are real malware samples that succeeded on infecting real customers' machines. And among all discoveries that can be made about this data set, what grabs immediately everybody's attention at first glance is the diversity of file formats used in these attacks. Whereas the global literature states that PE files are prevalent everywhere in the world, PE files that are portable executable, the typical file format used by Windows executable, these are not prevalent in Brazil. As you can see here, their usage has been decreasing over time. In the latest year, JavaScript is now the prevalent file format used by the attackers. And since the beginning, in each year, we have a new trend of a distinct file format being used by attackers, from the adoption of CPL files, control panel applets, to multi-platform malware written in .NET. So what explains this diversity in file format? What explains attackers shifting from one file format to another in a so short period of time? What explains, for instance, the emergence of Java-based malware, malware written in Java? There must be something beyond the technical aspects, maybe cultural, regional, or economical aspects, that explains such migration from one format to another. And in fact, in the case of Brazil, what shapes the way that the malware are delivered is the defenses themselves that are employed by the banks. Because the banks are aware that there are malware out there trying to infect their customers' machines and to perform fraud against them. So what banks decide to do to react and to fight this kind of attack, this kind of malware, was to require everybody, every customer, to install a security plugin. So it's mandatory for all customers that want to access internet bank of all major banks in Brazil. This plugin acts as an antivirus that is installed in your browser. It searches your computer in search for malware and any kind of malware, especially banking malware, trying to prevent you from being infected and a fraud to be concluded successfully. And what's the problem here? The problem is that this plugin is written in Java. So since the adoption of this plugin to the present, attackers can simply assume that Java is installed in every internet bank customer's machine. So there's a big population of Java-powered machines out there. So they can now simply distribute Java-written malware that are less detected by antivirus than their binary counterparts. So what the Brazilian scenario teaches here is that the way that we develop our defense also shapes the way that our attacks will be performed in the future. The way that we develop our defense also shapes the way that the attackers will react to that. And how can I be sure that there are the same attackers that are migrating from one format to the other? Well, that's because I have been tracking some of these attackers over time. Here I show, for instance, an example of a semi-attacking group that's responsible for more than 400 unique samples over a period of 7 years. And what we find here is that, in fact, what they are doing is migrating from one file format to another. We can see here they are migrating, for instance, from DLL files to CPL files. They are changing the way that they are packaged, so the packing solution changes their prevalence from 1 year to another. But in the end, what is common among all versions of the malware samples created by these criminals is that they are all password stealers. So what we need to do is to change the incentives for the success of the password stealing attempt, instead of trying to pursue each file format that are being released over time. So there's no problem for the attackers to migrate from one file format to another, as you can see here, that what they are doing in practice, since their goal is successful and their goal is to steal passwords. So we need to change the incentives for that more than changing any technological issue, any technology behind the creation and deployment of these malware attacks. So leaving the past behind, let's now talk about the present, the age of mobile banking and mobile devices, when finally all the security promises become true, right? Well, unfortunately not. I mean, the security nowadays is indeed much better than it was in the past, but there's still lots of restriction, especially economical constraints. For instance, for the case of Brazil, most part of the population was only computerized recently, already in the age of mobile devices. So they skipped the process of learning security via those previous incidents that I have presented. Moreover, adopting mobile banking brings new security challenges that I will present in more details. In Brazil, unlimited mobile data plans are very expensive. And by very expensive, I mean very expensive. So the most popular plans are all limited. Among all, likely the most popular is the WhatsApp free plan. WhatsApp is for free and nothing else. No internet banking. So to operate in this scenario of limited plans, what banks did was to adopt WhatsApp-based transactions, since everybody was using WhatsApp via those free plans. As you can see here in the figures, the banks developed chatbots to operate in WhatsApp. So you can send a message to a chatbot, and the chatbot will perform the banking transaction for you. You can even transfer money from one account to another, sending a message to one of those bank chatbots. But there's a problem here, and a security problem. By outsourcing your operation from your own app to a third-party app, you are also outsourcing the security of your operation to a third party. So if the threat model of your operation and of the third-party app is very different, you might have problems. Being more clearly, when you are developing your own app, you can control all permissions that are requested by the app. If you are a banking app, you can restrict, for instance, accessibility services, which prevent an attacker from deploying a fake keyboard to keylogger what the user is typing on your application. But if you are deploying your service on top of WhatsApp, for instance, you are adopting WhatsApp threat model that is completely different from a bank threat model, and WhatsApp does not restrict any accessibility services, any malicious actor can deploy and distribute a malicious accessibility service, for instance, a malicious keyboard that types something on behalf of you on WhatsApp. And this fake application, this fake accessibility service, might, for instance, perform a transaction for you in one of those chatbots. That's exactly what's happening right now in Brazil. So here's a good point to ask you. Does your threat model consider WhatsApp? Does your threat model consider bank operations over WhatsApp? Or even, does your threat model consider users with limited data plans? Well, so far I have presented how the historical, cultural, social, and economical aspects shapes attacks and defenses in many distinct scenarios. But one might still ask, okay, but technologically and technically, is the Brazilian malware really different? And I will prove that. Here I presented the difference on the malicious behaviors exhibited by the Brazilian malware samples collected by our banking partner and the US and Japanese samples collected by a partner security company. And it's quite clear that the samples are very different. For instance, Brazilian samples were the ones that most interacted via network, because since they are password stealers, their stolen data need to be exfiltrated via the network to their command and control servers. On the other hand, US samples were the ones that mostly exhibited interaction with the file system, because since I presented in the beginning of this presentation, ransomware was trending there by that time, a trend that never happened in Brazil. So it's quite clear that the samples are very different according to the location. So it's time to stop writing malware reports that do not fully and clearly state which period of time is considered, which population and which country is represented by those malware samples. And this difference in the malware samples from one place to another help explaining the results I was talking about in the beginning of my presentation, why my results were often different. Because most of the promised 99% accuracy or detection rate of most solutions is only achieved when considered a fully balanced data set. But in reality, things are not balanced, as you can see here. This is what we observed by looking to the prevalence of malware family in the customer's machines. So they are much more targeted by some malware families than by the others, according to the bias of each region. So isn't it time to start thinking about the development of solutions for unbalanced data set? And talking about detection solution, look what happens when considered antivirus detection of the so-called global samples and the reported Brazilian samples. We notice that for both binaries and web pages, the Brazilian samples are consistently less detected than the so-called global samples, which indicates that the security companies are missing something, are missing some aspect of the cultural and local malware samples when training their models. And talking about training a model, look what happens when we try to train a machine learning model to detect those Brazilian samples. Do you remember when I presented that Brazilian attackers were often changing the distributed file format from one year to another? So what happens when try to train a machine learning classifiers considering those Brazilian malware samples is that the classifier tends to drift, as shown here by those high bars in the figure. So from time to time, the concept learned by the classifier is not meaningful anymore because the distributed malware sample changed so much that they are not representative of what the malware classifier learned. And as you can see here, the cluster formed by the malwares from period to period is often very different. So we should stop developing ad hoc machine learning models and start considering concept drift detectors in the model, because in reality, what happens is that malware evolves so fast that we need to update frequently what we consider as a malware. But well, now we know what is happening out there, now we know some of this problem, what to do? First of all, we need to understand and acknowledge the importance of those regionalized studies. Enigma gave me this opportunity to talk to you here, and the guys are doing a great job, but we need more. We need much more. Because, for instance, we have specific issues and specific venues to publish systematization of knowledge papers, to publish survey papers, to publish offensive work. So what about regional studies? Does your call for papers includes the call for regional studies? And if you are developing a model, or if you are reviewing a paper about a model, get rid of the concept that everything should be balanced. You start thinking about the real world. What can go wrong? In the real world, things might get very awkward very fast. So think about unbalanced data set and unbalanced types of malware. And if you are running a business, are you sure that you understand your customers' needs? Do you understand what happens in the country in which your customer lives? Do you have a local team there to help you understand what happens in the local scenario? By this time you are leaving, everybody is working from home, so there's no excuse anymore to have a local team elsewhere, all around the world. And that's it. I hope I might have helped, and thanks for having me.